Sure.
Okay, go. Welcome. Yes.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I'm very, very excited today to, again, have with us Mr. Dan Winter and also a very talented engineer, Miss Elizabeth Donavan. I was actually quite surprised when Mr. Winter said she was with us, but without further ado, I'm extremely grateful and excited and humbled. And sir, the floor is yours.
Great. I'm happy to be here. So as you know, I'm Dan Winter, fractalfield.com. Today's conversation is about understanding the physics, the science principles of zero-point energy, vacuum energy. And I have invited a special guest with us, Elizabeth Donavan, who has been a very high-level engineer partner with me on many related projects for many years, actually. And specifically, if I may suggest, if it's okay with you, Dave and Elizabeth, I have actually a prepared set of visuals. It's very brief, probably 20 minutes, 20, 25 max, on the physics of zero-point energy, vacuum energy coherence, quote unquote free energy, which I believe Dave had said he had some questions related to zero-point energy earlier. So that's why I got some of those slides together. And then I was going to do like, I don't know, 20 minutes. And then maybe if Elizabeth, if you're in the mood to comment at that point, it's up to you.
Sure.
Great, because Elizabeth is, you know, I'm an electrical engineer, but on a very technical side, Elizabeth is one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever met, I have to say. And so, yes, but at any rate, so I'm going to start right in. Then I'm going to see if I can dig out this slideshow that I prepared entitled Zero-Point Energy, Keynote Zero-Point Energy. There it is. Okay, clicking share now. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my electrical principles of zero-point vacuum coherence energy, April 2022. So the website on which we've been gathering this information on zero-point energy for many years, fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, which starts with the major international keynote presentation I did at the Breakthrough Energy Movement on zero-point vacuum energy 2 years ago in Amsterdam. And the point that was made at that time, and which I'd like to echo right now, was that all of the speakers speaking about zero-point energy and vacuum energy and quote unquote free energy, you know, there were very intelligent conversations. However, not one of those conversations ever, even once, asked the question, what is the electrical principle behind zero-point or vacuum coherence energy? And that is precisely the question I would like to hint. And this is obviously only a short teaser tonight, but so what the point what we want to make is we believe that if you understood why objects fall to the ground, and if you understood the electrical cause of life, then you might have a clue to the electrical cause of zero-point energy. Hello. So we start with the very oversimplistic example of Victor Schauberger. Now, his water vortex here was piezoelectrically doped. That means there's a little bit of rock or quartz piezo powder in the water, making the water very piezo, not unlike biodynamic dynamization. And the point being then, at a high vortex speed, if the container is high dielectric, ideally, and at the bottom was 50,000 RPM flat impeller, and I actually saw these things work thanks to Implosion Research Center, Jonathan and Dolly in Plymouth, UK, actually. And the point at which this made voltage from gravity so well as a generator that apparently Hitler wrote a check, that the voltage difference is between the widest midpoint here versus the narrowest point on the bottom. And that is a bit of a clue, because the narrow point of the egg is the point of, quote, plasma projection. And literally, the voltage difference, which is pressure difference, remember, voltage is pressure. The pressure difference is the place where the charge, if that angle of that vortex cone is appropriate, and Bill in our group made some equations about vortex gravity making, aka the Mercury vortex of the Hannibal, et cetera. And you can find Elizabeth Donovan's book about that at fractalfield.com/propulsion. So this would be an example of a not just a device to propel charge implosively into a longitudinal array at the sharp point, as it were, but also by virtue of that implosion, giving the charge a way to go out through center exactly the mystery that Einstein could not solve when he said he knew gravity was infinite non-destructive compression, but he didn't know where the charge went when it was constructively compressed. Well, now we know at precisely the Planck threshold, the charge is accelerated through the speed of light into a longitudinal array, specifically at the Planck threshold, looking somewhat like this, which brings up the next sort of fun question here, which is, one of the most elegant zero-point energy devices you have around you all the time is a pine cone. And if you've ever actually used a pine cone for rainmaking, as I have, you understand the famous book about pine cone and life force called Vortex of Life, Fields of Form, Lawrence Edwards in the biodynamic tradition, in which it's very graphically documented elaborately that the angle of the seeds on that pine cone open and close slowly throughout the year, modulating capacitively how much energy this device is getting from gravity. Hint, a zero-point energy device, okay? Namely life force. Remember, we have a very high dielectric layered fractal capacitor here. And if you feel the negative ion wind out the end of a really live pine cone, you know what I mean. So the principle of how that makes voltage from gravity is our old story, which you've all seen this slide way too many times. The point is the golden ratio phase conjugate fractality, the cause of life force, gravity, and zero-point energy allows the wavelength and the phase velocities to add and multiply recursively constructively, phase conjugate fractality. And that turns that form of compression, fractal, into acceleration. Remember, adding and multiplying constructively of the wavefront phase velocities, which is the origin of the charge acceleration toward center, named the gravity, but also named the implosion of charge called vacuum energy, zero-point energy, vacuum coherence. In other words, if you want zero-point energy, vacuum energy, get more fractal than the Earth underneath you and implode. You implode the charge. So that's a basic intro to the concept that imploding charge to accelerate through the speed of light at the Planck threshold into longitudinal is the cause of life, consciousness, and gravity specifically. Now we're going to give specific electrically measured examples thereof. Here's example number one. Example number one here is the Visico Bosnian pyramid power spectra, top right, which measurement made by Patrick Botti, our hero of life force measure, flameinmind.com/lifeforce. We're showing here that the frequency signature of the Visico Bosnian pyramid, here you have 53 hertz, around 32, around 22. Okay, now if you look at the reference chart below at the Schumann harmonics on the bottom right versus the calculation of Planck times integer exponents golden ratio origin and negentropy, you see the Schumann harmonics in green, the calculated harmonics in blue. So the calculation of the harmonics ideal actually would be 50 hertz, but all over we're measuring 53 hertz. And we finally figured out why, because the actual Schumann 7.83 times golden ratio harmonics equals 53 hertz. The theoretically correct 7.29 Schumann harmonic would equal 50 hertz. So 50 hertz is the theoretical ideal, but 53 is close. And that's why the Earth, as Gaia, is negentropic, because it's imploding charge. The Earth, Gaia, is a zero-point energy device precisely because its Schumann harmonics are phase conjugate times Planck. The point would we make here is this pyramid is an example of success in what Tesla failed to do, which was make a global powerless grid without wires. We know that the ancients, if you understand Arcturus probe and the book 2/3 of David Myers and David Percy, that the pyramid was called the Hummer. Well, the reason it's called the Hummer was because it hummed. And what did it hum with? The Schumann harmonics. And what did that do? It was a phase conjugate pump wave to implosively propel a longitudinal wave into an array. In that case, that array was a longitudinal called dodecaecosa sacred sites around the planet where the global wireless power was successful. And we know the advanced ETs, Galactic Federation and more, who really designed why all the pyramids are at the dodecaecosa nodes was because they were successful at making global wireless power. Hint, 0-point energy because they got more fractal than the Earth underneath them and imploded charge. Other examples is why there's mercury in those pyramids to support that phase conjugate pump wave. That's quite a story, but the reason they found mercury in the pyramids. And so this was part of the presentation about understanding how you pump into and participate in a longitudinal array. Because one of the points we're going to make now as we look at various 0-point energy devices, which are now commercially offered, is most of the people offering them don't understand why they work better at the sacred sites and they work terrible over a railroad track. Because if you want to implode charge, there are some limitations, and they apply to every single 0-point energy device. And the people that don't get that are having trouble marketing their device. So anyway, as we talked about Tesla's mistakes here, Tesla was obviously a fabulous genius, as was Einstein, but they had a few little issues. In Tesla's case, he didn't understand where the longitudinal nodes were for efficient pickup, and he didn't understand the correct frequency signature because he didn't have my equation, Planck times golden ratio. So for example, Tesla chose 60 hertz, which he now wouldn't know was such a bad mistake that in the United States, you will not be able to make carbon nano the best tech on the planet because you need 50 hertz because that's golden ratio times Planck, not 60, et cetera, et cetera. 50 hertz is the most common healing frequency mentioned in all the cancer literature. So you've seen my slides on this. This is all at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. We're not picking on Tesla, nor are we picking on Einstein. And you've all seen my slide picking on Einstein here. Einstein-induced insanity. Well, it is insane not to know why objects fall to the ground. I mean, that is insanity, sorry. And to think the speed of light is a speed limit. And to think it takes infinite energy to go through the speed of light. And to think all action at a distance is spooky. I mean, yeah, Einstein got some things very wrong. Now, he was an absolute genius in his patents, and the relativity is fabulous. And I'm not even competent to criticize so much of his work. But on the other hand, there was some insanity, incorrectly and weirdly believing space-time is somehow bent. Wrong. What is bent is the trajectory for charge, and not understanding that both mass and time are both created and defined only by the inertia and period of charge rotation, defining mass and time. So here's another 0-point energy device on top. This blue curve, this is the power spectra, low frequencies, of some living rose oil. Here's a 0-point energy. This is a healing oil. This is real rose heal. And in pink is the power spectrum of synthetic rose perfume. But if you look at the frequency cascade in the real healing oil, and this is in terms of measuring life force. So once you can measure life force, you can measure 0-point energy because you can measure implosion. So I want to give another example. This is after years of work with Joe of Joe Cell fame in Lismore, Australia, which just was flooded, sadly. And the Joe Cell device uses concentric metal tubes for implosive capacitance. We now know it's literally phase conjugate capacitance. And you even need to know which direction the tube was extruded so the grain structure would allow that implosive capacitance to be leak-free. So the way you chose your metal tubes was very, very critical. But once you did that, then this implosive capacitance would charge the water and do hydrolysis, literally over unity hydrolysis. And there's one critical point I want to make about this Joe cell. In the top right slide, you see the hydrogen foam burning on the top right, and this over unity hydrolysis. And we later found out the Kansas's over unity hydrolysis was based on golden ratio times Planck too. But he said, you set this up and then, quote, you wait for it to condition the space. Now, I'd like just to suggest a short meditation on that. You know, when you set up Therify plasma to heal people, it's a little better if you wait for it to condition the space. Now, if you sit planning your meditation and prayer, it might be a little useful to wait for it to condition the space. What does that mean? Well, I can tell you that when you drove this car running on 0-point hydrogen over a railroad track, it would generally quit. And I'm going to show you other devices, which are 0-point energy devices, that will quit if you put them inside a steel box or on a railroad track. But the reason it would quit was because the steel has the wrong dielectric constant and would bleed the building charge, preventing it from conditioning the space. What that means effectively is the array around the implosive capacitance or implosive magnetic or the mag, there's many examples, that array actually needs to organize itself into what we now know as a dodecaecosa fractal phase conjugate array in order that the charge distribution efficiency can build to implode the charge of the vacuum. Again, you've all seen this charge way too many times, but you see I later proved this is the geometry of hydrogen here, but in the side view of the vortex, which is the radiative hydrogen, you see the caduceus, and what's happening is the transverse charge entering at one end goes down the caduceus in the golden spiral on the cone and is compressed into a longitudinally coherent emerging wave, which is also the definition of a gravity wave, if you believe Tom Bearden. And that is where the charge goes down the rabbit hole. And the ability to send that charge implosively down that rabbit hole is the cause of gravity, life force, and zero-point energy. So this is talking about phase conjugation, four-wave mixing. You've seen these slides, and you've all seen these slides that the golden ratio is the solution to that problem, non-destructive compression. And you've all seen this slide too many times, that my original equation, origin of neg entropy, Planck times integer exponent of the golden ratio, predicts all the critical frequencies, hydrogen, radii, ADP, British foot, sacred dimension, photosynthesis, Schumann harmonics, Venus here, Earth here, galactic. So these are the harmonics which allow implosive charge collapse. Therefore, life force, consciousness, and zero-point energy. And notice that Elizabeth Donavan, formerly William Donavan, was the co-author of several of our critical papers on this, who was with us this evening, and Elizabeth is to credit for many things in this regard. In this case, Martin Jones, our other co-author, helped us with the generalized Klein-Gordon wave equations to prove that golden ratio in general solves the problem of maximum constructive wave interference and therefore solves the problem of implosive constructive charge compression, and by implication solves the problem of what is the cause of gravity and zero-point energy. So here we just mentioned that Nassim Haramein famously also showed, when he looked at the Planck atomic, stellar, galactic, and universe dimensions, proved that the ratio between all those dimensions is golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio. And he talked about in terms of implosive charge collapse. Our friend Elizabeth Rauscher, a very famous physicist recently deceased, said that she had done most of the mathematics on this for or with Nassim. Here we see in our implosive hydrolysis lab in Melbourne an example of the harmonic signature of implosive collapse, charge collapse, in the waveform on the spectrum analyzer. So you actually see when it's called perfect damping, which is perfect implosion. So you can actually identify golden ratio damping in a spectrum analyzer. It's pretty cool. This is talking about the implosive charge collapse. We're going to look at examples, Keshe, for example, of implosive charge collapse in rotating conjugators. An example of a conjugator being carbon nano of sufficient purity. And the carbon nanotubes obviously seem to have the geometry we're interested in, as you can see. And this is all at fractalfield.com/cold plasma. And so other examples of this is the implosive propulsion devices related to Searle. The Searle devices, we'll be talking about those, and the Townsend-Brown effect. So the Townsend-Brown effect is an example of implosive capacitance. If the baked egg white is high dielectric, and then you get the geometry concave enough, that baked egg white is a gravity device. He baked the egg whites in Townsend-Brown, and Paul Laviolette wrote a whole book about propulsion from Townsend-Brown. So, and this is then the work which is indirectly related to Hanabu being a Mercury vortex. And again, some of those equations for optimized spiral on a vortex for propulsion and zero-point energy are at fractalfield.com/propulsion, much acknowledging Elizabeth Donavan there as well. So this is Hodowanek and Ramsey showing an example of using a capacitor to measure what would be the wave front of one could talk about as a longitudinal wave, in this case, a gravity wave, in the rust track recorder, famously Hodowanok and Ramsey. What he showed was a 25-cent capacitor can pick up a gravity wave better than Weber's $1 million gravity sensor or the LIGOR by simply measuring the wavefront of the implosive capacitance of a gravity wave. And indeed, the gravity waves travel faster than light, and that's all in Hodowanok and Ramsey. So an example of conditioning the space is the dodeca-ecosa Earth grid. The universe is dodeca, according to Nature magazine, and New Scientist says the universe is fractal. So the big argument about Townsend Brown and then later Searle was, if that implosive capacitor, you simply put a high DC voltage on that surface and you will create lift. That's old news. That's not new information. And you'll create implosion, and by inference, 0-point energy. But the argument was, well, whether this could happen in a vacuum. And that brought up the excellent question of, well, is a vacuum really nothing or not? And it may be that Elizabeth later in this conversation will discuss the fact that the resonance and the impedance of the vacuum is known. But the vacuum, like the gravity around Earth, is not homogeneous. But in fact, these devices did make gravity in the vacuum, as Searle claims correctly, I believe, because the vacuum is not empty. And Nassim also got that right. He says there's a huge amount of inertia in the vacuum, and that's exactly correct. And that charge inertia is simply circulating charge. And perfecting the circulation of charge defines the ability to have 0-point or vacuum energy. So all these people are running around saying, oh, they cheated us. Tesla wanted us to have free energy and we've been cheated. Well, actually, my challenge to those people is go out and learn the physics of perfected charge circulation, and then you'll know what 0-point energy is. So this is the another example of plasma projection, and by inference 0-point energy, the Egyptian JED, a golden ratio based plasma projection, a JEDI, the JED tower. And we've talked about this. And here's some of the early experiments of implosive capacitance, pent on top and on the bottom, these very high dielectric gold chips. And there was an incredible negative ion wind from the gold array on the bottom left here. And this is about a 1 meter tall cone on which we were placing these capacitors to make implosive capacitance. I mean, there's lots of ways to squirt a longitudinal wave, and that is a way to make gravity, measure many different. And this is capacitor array. This is a graphic not from our group showing implosive capacitor arrays. And this is another array we made. September 05. This is almost 20 years ago, but we claimed that when we first fired this thing up, it triggered a storm, much like proper use of a pine cone. Actually, you know, the cone capacitor Trevor Constable used to make rain in weather engineering on the high seas was a 60-degree cone. Hint, the vortex into a dodeca. Actually, specifically, this cone right here, 60-degree cone, is the angle of the capacitor, cone capacitor, orgone, Wilhelm Reich, used by Trevor Constable for the best rainmaking in weather engineering in the high seas. But obviously, implosive capacitance is a rainmaker because any centripetal charge can cause water vapor to come to a point, which is to agree to touch. And that permission to touch is rainmaking. That's why patriarchy causes deserts. It's been measured because it's failure to touch. So this is from the Therify text, so therify.net, that my equation in top in purple, and these are the frequencies Priori used, and Elizabeth helped us even dig this out. And we see that the harmonic series that later became Therify actually were predicted by Priori, who got them from Minkowski and Rife. And so that the actual bifiller Tesla coil in Therify is actually a 0-point energy device. If it's installed in a very life force environment, it will generate charge from the vacuum. It's pretty fun, actually. And these are those same harmonics in a magnetic field shown to produce pain reduction in Elizabeth Rauscher's FDA trials based on my equation on top. And this is when Elizabeth agreed that I had invented phase conjugate magnetics, which are another way to talk about. So here is another implosive capacitor, the Ark of the Covenant, golden ratio, super high dielectric acacia wood, et cetera, and it would stabilize the monoatomic gold in the monoatomic state, and hence Holy Communion, gold powder making, and Related is the rotating ping pong balls of Mr. Keshe. We were in his living room several times, and you can see that his partners there, they put these spinning ping pong balls and floated his car. They made some gravity. The truth is they don't know how to make it pure enough, and they don't understand the physics. But the physics is a rotating conjugator is a 0-point energy device if you know how to make it pure enough. And that's the interesting physics here, that the geometry of the cone, the speed of the cone, and the purity of the nanomaterials, all to make the perfect conjugator, is in fact a 0-point energy device, and therefore gravity making and energy making. I wanted to speak a little bit about the SAFE device. This is from the famous Maxwell Chikumbutso in South Africa that Foster Gamble in Thrive 2 took his electrical engineer, and they made the measurements. And indeed, this device is over unity. It's well proven, and there's big fights over it, of course. But the principle, no one even asked the question. Not Foster Gamble, not his electrical, nobody even bothered to ask, how does it work? Because everybody just assumes we don't have a clue. And I find that disturbing. And the principle actually is clear. You have, there's a battery bank in there, and the batteries are inverse capacitance. And Elizabeth may even choose to speak to that. And the point is, if you tune the inductive reactance between the battery bank and the resonance circuit, which is RF triggered in this case, as they mentioned, that is a feedback loop that can become recursive and implosive. And that's the point. And that's actually the core behind Bedini. And so actually all the people who've been working with Bedini in the States, an over unity battery charging based on over unity inverted, there's always a battery in the circuit because that's actually part of the implosive inductive reactance. And I think I have the Bedini. Yeah. Okay. So here's Bedini. They have these conferences. Adam Murakami helped sponsor all these conferences now that John Bedini is dead. And these groups have been gathering for years. And they have all these circuits which will do over unity battery charging. And the reason is because the battery becomes part of a tank circuit whose resonance geometry becomes implosive. And idealizing that implosive geometry is precisely the point. And another example of said is the South Korean famous device, infinitysalve.com, commercially on the market, 0-point energy, you can order one. And I think Paul's criticism from the knowledge of his attendance at all the Bedini groups is appropriate here. Paul suggested that, yes, these were working, but, and here's the but, there was a limitation about stability, and the stability had to do with where you put it. And guess what they don't understand? Hello. You don't want to try imploding charge from the vacuum if you're sitting over a railroad track in the middle of geopathic everything. It ain't gonna work. Just the reason that Joe sells implosive hydrogen cars kept quitting when they get in the wrong spot. So until somebody, it's the old story, until somebody teaches the physics principles behind how these devices work. For example, Antoine Priory was spending millions of dollars on every plasma device he built and could not commercialize because no one could teach the principle. Hello. And so here this applies as well. Until we understand the principle, the electrical principles behind 0-point vacuum energy and make that teachable, the core principles, then we can not only commercialize, we can use them intelligently. For example, they actually have the potential to destabilize gravity if they're done on a large scale. So that was my, as it were, my 2 cents is now in. I don't know, Elizabeth, Elizabeth is much deeper into some of the technical electrical engineering of some of this. Elizabeth, would you care to comment at this point?
Anything specific?
Well, for example, around, I don't know, phase conjugate dielectrics, or some of the most interesting 0-point energy devices that you are currently studying. Bill is an expert on almost every 0-point energy device that's ever been designed in the US. It's amazing. Actually.
Okay, well, anyway, one of the things that you can create as well, one is a broken symmetry system where you have one motional system right next to a stationary system, And with that one, it creates a there's an energy differential due to the delta between the two of them. So that's one way. And then the other way is, well, there's there's several different ways. There's transmutation. There's using current-free potentials. That is, you can actually disconnect charge, which is basically empty space itself, from the mass. And when you disconnect the charge from the mass, then obviously you can create over-unity effects as well. So there's several devices that do that. For example, in the original Tesla switch, when they're producing a switching effect, which is around 400 to 800 hertz. 800 is unstable, by the way. But at 400 hertz, what's happening is that you're switching it faster than the ions inside the battery can actually flow from one plate to another. So it becomes a current-free potential, which means now you can operate a load without discharging the battery. Actually, you can charge the battery at the same time you're operating the load. And so that's another thing. Tesla coils are famous for disconnecting the charge from the charged mass as well. Peter Lindemann also talks about having a brush discharge being an ether current, which is not actually correct. So what we're looking at is a disconnection between the charge and charged mass, so that the phonon current that is actually in the wire that's pushing the electrons through it, and that through radiation pressure and can actually produce that brush discharge. So that's another thing to look at, is what the original theory was for conduction inside of a wire, which is has been eliminated from the textbooks over the past 70 years or so, actually more than that. So that's another thing. So
there are literally, there's hundreds of
you
these
have to go
technologies.
back to the original electromagnetics of Maxwell to really understand all this stuff.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes, and actually, it was Elizabeth who helped me understand when your question in the previous event, Dave, about how Maxwell's equations were kind of castrated and therefore could not represent spin. Most of that concept came from my conversations with Elizabeth here. Elizabeth is also deeply involved in our cold fusion research, sort of next step past the Rossi group, credit to Roger here. And Elizabeth is actually an expert at calculating the isotope transitions, both critical in temperature and frequency, and much, much more, all of which we don't have time for this evening. But maybe another time, or even at a technical level, if you want to have conversations with Elizabeth. And in the meantime, perhaps we could open to questions here, unless there was something more that you wanted to say right now, Elizabeth, not to interrupt.
Well, the other thing is that, mass can be looked at as frozen energy, but also as a standing wave structure.
Exactly.
And, so using those standing wave structures have a frequency, which means now you're getting into the phonon resonance of mass itself. Now you can get into transmutation. And the easiest way to do this is between nuclear isomers, which are, elements right next to each other in the periodic table. So, for example, in the PAGD tube of the Koreas, they were putting hydrogen and mercury 196 inside the tube. And then they said that it was disappearing. They're getting this annoying yellow film on the inside of the tube. Well, that was gold. I mean, it was basically transmuting the mercury 196 to gold 197. And they thought they were actually getting something from the ether when it was actually a nuclear transformation.
And the point is that Elizabeth is kind of the world's expert at calculating the critical frequency and temperature for those isotope transitions. And that is the physics of alchemy. And by the way, Elizabeth, we're planning a new show for kids entitled Harry Potter, we found the Philosopher's Stone of Flamel, and here's the physics. And so that conversation is to be continued. But the point is that what Elizabeth has written on this, it's a many 100-page spreadsheet with the equations. Again, it's probably beyond the scope of this present conversation. But Elizabeth, I suggest we open this to questions, then you can help, I'm sure, for now.
Oh, sure. And what the spreadsheet essentially is it's how to convert one element into another element. And again, the easiest thing is in nuclear isomers. But I mean, you could actually create fusion effects between dissimilar elements as well. The yields are different. Sometimes they require energy to transform into another one. And other times they liberate so much energy that, I mean, you have to really be careful what you're doing. So, yeah.
There was a famous guy named Joe Champion who had calculated critical temperature for some isotope transitions, but Elizabeth radically expanded that work to both critical frequency and temperature for virtually every useful isotope transition in the atomic table. I mean, this is real alchemy. It's cool stuff, and we don't have time to do that conversation tonight. But let's have see where we go.
Sure. Thank you so much. So first and foremost, I just wanted to say, Dan, truly, thank you for the little presentation there, and thank you, Ms. Donavan, for coming in, because you guys are speaking my language, so to speak. You're preaching to the choir with respects to what I've been told. Dare I say, it could be nonsense, but what I've been told off the record by some American officials as what has been deemed as national security information is what you're seemingly describing publicly. So I want to thank you so very much, Ms. Donavan, for even joining this call today. Now, I have a couple questions myself, but I want to be sure to get to the audience as well. But I did want to ask something here from Brandy, because I think it's a very good question or point she was trying to make. So she said to me, a vacuum is created whenever one thing is moved or given to another, and something will immediately fill that space. But in order for it to move into the next space, it must assimilate or coalesce. Same in magic. When one banishes, you must also invoke. Otherwise, the space will be filled with whatever is closest and or easiest or convenient. Would this be fairly accurate from an electrical engineering standpoint, perhaps?
I was just reading a paper that the physics of the existence of inertia proves the fact that something must get shoved aside in the vacuum for anything to move.
Right.
So the fact that inertia exists means something in the vacuum had to get pushed aside. And it's true that a vacuum is created anytime anything moves. There's a pressure differential. Pressure differential is both air pressure and voltage, which is the name for pressure. So that's absolutely true. And what was the second part of the question? It was about
well, actually, according to Shinichi Seiki, the vacuum has 10 to the 93rd ergs per cubic centimeter. That's a huge amount.
So cool.
So
cool.
And what happens is that the matter that we're familiar with is just a small fraction of that. It's a modulation on the vacuum.
Yep.
And it's such a tiny modulation that it could also be seen as it's actually almost below the level of observation. So then we get the whole concept of Maya. We're in the world of illusion because it's almost below the level of observation. So if we're tapping into the vacuum itself, then I mean, we just want to tap a small amount of that. But because we can do that alchemically, well, in a nuclear basis alchemically, or that we can do this energetically in several different ways. I mean, just think of space as just charge. Right. It's free dot. I mean, there are several different people that have already established that. TJJC, for example, PAM Dirac, and several others. So, but I mean, all of this work has been suppressed.
Right.
I mean, that's the interesting part of it.
Yep.
And Elizabeth is an expert on that suppression too. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, this is, I mean, you want to talk about synchronicities and my being grateful again, Ms. Donavan, for you joining Dan today. Thank you so very much, because I did want to ask to follow on that, Dan, when you were, and this is to both Elizabeth and Dan, when you were speaking, Dan, particularly on the South Korea energy generator, if I'm not mistaken, and you said some of the issues were controlling the vacuum fluctuations. If I don't want to put words in your mouth. They couldn't control the energy, if I understood that correctly.
Paul indicated to me, our other partner, that the major marketing problem was that they were having stability issues. And by inference, we believe those stability issues have to do with its location. Very few of these people understand, if you take a spectrum analysis of the weak capacitance of a location, you find out where you are on the gravity grid and how much energy from the vacuum is available.
Does this have anything to do with containing the plasma inertia?
It has to do with conditioning the space. It has to do with charge distribution efficiency, has to do with dielectric constant. Basically, it means if you're on the cross point node of the Earth energy grid, you've got a huge amount of that available, which is why the ancients put the pyramid at the dodecahedral grid, because that was global wireless power distribution. It was very efficient. And these people who are building zero-point energy devices who don't get that are having stability problems.
Okay. Okay. Ms. Donavan, would you like to jump in? If not, I just wanted to follow up with that very quickly.
Oh, sure, sure. I just noticed in the chat that there was somebody that was asking about generation of the vacuum directed could be a form of propulsion as vacuum closes behind generator. But if you have a differential between, the charge in the front and the charge in the back, charge can also be seen as a way of stressing space itself. It's creating more of a curvature in time than space.
Thank you.
So that's another thing. And the Nasikas device is very famous for this thing, especially the type 1 thruster.
Sort of like if you took a rubber mat and dragged it with you on one side. If
yes.
you were
or
the Albuquerque drive is similar to that, right?
The Albuquerque, or just the classic EM drive, which is a trapezoidal microwave. And if that microwave is tuned to implosive phase conjugate collapse, you get some longitudinal projection at one end, basically, hence gravity.
Right.
Oh, yeah. It's very inefficient compared to the thruster, but yeah.
And I just wanted to touch on one more thing before we get to the audience, but sorry, Dan, did you want to?
No, go ahead, please.
So someone asked as well, and I wanted to address this as well, because I think I speak for the layman when people bring up zero-point energy as it's becoming more of a mainstream term. Dare I say, and I could be wrong, that the term zero-point energy seems to be conflated with the term quantum. And the word conscious. It's used all over the place, and everyone's like, okay, what does it truly mean? Well, I was watching some presentations and lectures from some other electrical engineers in the 1980s, 1990s, and allegedly the reason it's termed zero-point energy is because regardless if you shrink space or temperature down to its 0 point, that particular energy still remains. Would that be an accurate depiction of 0 point?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that 10 to the 93rd ergs is still there at absolute zero. So yeah.
At zero time. And I think also originally it was thought that the wave collapses to zero, but in fact now we believe, and I think my equation is evidence, that the wave specifically only collapses to the Planck threshold, and there it is converted into longitudinal, superluminal, called the gravity wave. And so it's not quite a 0 point collapse. Its better term would be a Planck collapse. But calling something quantum simply because it's quantized is pretty vague, because everything is.
Right.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article on that called Walking the Planck.
Good listen.
Huh. So since we have you here, Elizabeth, if I may ask, I'm not sure if you had seen Theories of Everything, Kurt Jaimungal's show with Salvatore Pais, the UFO Navy patent guy, and he kept saying it goes back to this Planck scale. But when Mr. Jaimungal kept asking, what's the math behind it, he said this is an issue of national security. I can't say, because he's got NDAs and all of this. Does this ring a bell?
Well,
I actually went back to the there's several different devices that I think actually do work. And one of them is Koski-Frost, going back to 1927. And I talked with Jerry Gallimore when he was still alive. And I basically said, Jerry, bottom line, is this thing real? And he said, yes, absolutely. And I said, okay, well, do I have permission to repeat it? He said, yeah, go ahead. And so I've been collecting a lot of information on that one. Now, with that being said, anybody that produces a gravity system like that, these things actually will radiate longitudinal waves, which have a signature which can be picked up.
So the military can track it.
Well,
right.
But the ability to squirt a
Yeah.
longitudinal wave is the key to gravity, but it's also the key to consciousness. So they can't make that illegal too. But and I would say that Elizabeth's book on the Koski-Frost device, which is the warp propulsion, Scotty, the dilithium crystals. In this case, it was lithium niobate, but it was a phase conjugate RF pump wave, and it made 800 times its own weight in gravity. And Elizabeth should be saying this, not me. But all of that, with credit to Elizabeth, is at fractalfield.com/static propulsion. But back to your question of is there an equation for the Planck energy? It is specifically exponents of integer exponents golden ratio times Planck. That is the answer to that question. And that is not, no one can say that's controlled by national security right now, because that's public information.
Thank you so much for that. And I wanted to ask to the both of you before we get to the questions is, could this also be why allegedly, I don't mean to put words in his mouth, I'm paraphrasing here, but Dr. Eric Davis, who works under the USDI at the Department of Defense and the Pentagon, he said one of the issues that the leaders, at least of the West and Europe have, or issues, dare I say in quotes, is that you can't quantify this on a legislative basis. What are you going to do? Create a law that people can't generate free energy after 6, 7 p.m.? It would be ridiculous. Would this be that same train of thought?
It would be like trying to pass a law. It was illegal to own pine cones.
Right.
or when Ingo Swann lit that thermistor, made a flame with his mind at the distance. That can't be illegal,
Right.
So it's true that the only way to do this is to make it empowering and teach it on a broad scale, actually. And it's true. Every powerful.
That's what they're afraid of, by the way.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
That's what they're afraid of.
Yeah.
For everybody to have this knowledge.
Yeah. Right.
Richard Kirkton was asking in the chat window. But
I was just going to read it.
Yeah, Tom Bearden's gravity. Well, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead,
Dave. Sure. Richard Kirton asks, I'm not technical. I was actually, thank you, Richard. I was going to ask about Mr. Bearden. I'm not technical, but I read a bit of Tom Bearden's Gravitobiology. Spiritually sensitive people are reporting changes in energy and intensity. Could this be a change in the enfolded electromagnetics radiated by the sun? And one aspect of the new telecommunications towers is to offset this. Dare I say, if without sounding too out there, I may be experiencing some of this myself. So thank you, Richard.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Elizabeth is an expert on Tom Bearden, even more than me. But if I may comment, I have taught many times that the physics of what's called the rapture in Christianity is specifically the conditioning of the array of the Earth, sometimes called photon cloud, as the Earth enters more and more gravitational compression symmetry. And more people, for example, then begin lucid dreaming. And it's also true that more people go crazy who are not ready for compression. The same kind of compression that's required for successful death and bliss is what's required for the rapture, which basically is to enter an array. And to inhabit that array without going nuts is to be able to remain centripetal, exactly for the same reason the Sufi tests whether they have pure intention by spinning in front of their master. If they don't get dizzy, then they have pure intention.
Would this be why? Again, this is a whole separate conversation about if they're the honesty and what have you. But could this be why certain, dare I say, current and ex-government officials are saying, seemingly to focus within yourself before asking, how many species are there, what are the craft made out of? Because whenever this dare I say transition occurs, you need to be like you said, Dan, centripetally focused and grounded and have a focal point spiritually, mentally, physically, or else you're just going to blow your brains out.
Well, let's find a gentle way to say that.
Sorry, I apologize. Sorry.
Absolutely right. We're saying is that the ETs, the Federation, my friend Elena, I'm making another film with Elena this week on galactic history, by the way, my fourth, Elena Donavan, whom I really recommend here, is saying that, the Federation has kicked out the Nebu, the Greys, and the Dracos. However, humans still have a lot of challenges to discover their role in the universe, which clearly now we understand, if we believe the nine, Thoth, and all that story, advanced plasma intelligences who seeded us in the first place, we believe, if you understand how pervasive Thoth was, which was basically that humans could be not just a vaccine for the Orion Wars, but could be a new way of ensoulment. That's why I think it's so profound to teach the physics of what triggers lucid dreaming, because that's how you inhabit the array. And that's where the human DNA has value in this galactic politics. It ain't our tech.
And this plasma intelligence that is said to be seen in quantum computers that have not been scaled back for the public, the real quantum computers that are allegedly top secret classified, it's been claimed that a little blue light could be sometimes seen almost intelligently creating symbols and what have you when working with these quantum computers. Could one postulate that's plasma intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, plasma intelligence in high dielectric materials is the good guys and the bad guys. We have met and encountered the enemy, and it is us. So you have the black goo, which is some of the most dangerous AI in the galaxy, and yet you have the cobblestone and the whole story about John Dee, using the obsidian mirrors. Well, super high dielectric materials allow very dense plasma charge circulation, which is mindfulness by definition. And so the difference between AI and having a soul is something we're going to have to understand very soon, or we're in deep doo-doo.
Okay. Scott asks, key to gravity and key to consciousness. Does that mean hypothetically one could generate a super consciousness? I take it this goes to either Dan or Elizabeth or both.
Well, all of the advanced shaman know the most advanced intelligence in our solar system is the sun, and it's the heart of the sun. It's very, very advanced in plasma intelligence. Obviously, that's why they saw the Anu, the 7 spins, 5 spins there. When the clairvoyants saw the heart of the sun, they saw the same symmetry of the heart of the human, the heart of hydrogen, called Anu. So plasma intelligence is a name for where plasma is implosive, and the more broad spectral that implosion, the more mindful it is. So here's a spoiler alert in Anton Park's History of Anki, the book entitled Secret of the Dark Stars. The spoiler alert is the dark stars intelligence is our ancestors. Talk about plasma intelligence.
Right.
The wormhole has mind, Deep Space Nine.
Wormhole has, okay, because the ancient Enochian texts now seem to accurately translate to serpent holes and having to do with memory inside of people's certain bloodlines. And okay. Sorry, Elizabeth, did you want to jump in? If not, I'll jump in.
Sure. And the other thing is that on some of the security cameras, they actually have, well, the CCDs, to back up a little bit, are sensitive in UV and the IR bands. And one thing that you could do is take out the filter in some of these, which I did. And in the lab, there was this small softball-sized orb that was following me around the lab. And you could actually see that and the HDR. And so when I showed that to people, say, oh, you've got a pet.
The plasma donut
intelligently following you around?
Yeah.
They say the same thing about the plasma donut from Therify Plasma. If the environment is really sympathetic in nature, the plasma donut will hang out like your pet puppy, and it decides if it likes you before it heals you.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much to the both of you for indulging us with this. Riel asks, could churches, mosques, and other sacred geometric structures be used as a global wireless power grid, whether for positive or negative? I guess that's indifferent, but
that, there's major arguments or discussions of that in the advanced geobiologists. goldenmean.info/geobiology, Stefan Cardinal, for example, says from the advanced geobiology school that many churches are, home for lots of messy plasma parasites. And for example, the onion dome shaped churches are less parasitic. And in fact, the same way a farmer can sue the government to remove a metal radio tower by doing a 25-cent measure of soil compaction at the base of the tower, thus proving the microorganisms died the day they installed the metal tower. You can do that same process around a church steeple to show which church killed the soil. and sharp points ain't so good unless.
Yeah, it gets into the longitudinal side too, because if you've got a longitudinal side effect going on with the tower, then it's producing changes in the soil down at the nuclear level as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I did want to. So Riel has a question about smartphones being designated not or designed not to catch certain phenomena. But before we get to that, because that actually speaks to a question I had as well. Scott asks, any perspective or take on why world governments would outlaw dikinin dye? Apparently, if it had some
Oh,
context,
dicyanin. Oh, yeah.
dicyanin. Excuse me.
Oh, there's a whole story behind that one.
They live. They live.
You want to start, Dan? Go ahead.
Yeah. That's one of Bill and I's favorite. So the hypothesis was in the movie They Live, the dark glasses that you put on that could allow you to see who was a soulless reptilian, because you see who doesn't have an aura. It's that dye you're talking about, and Bill knows the name. And and Bill just put in the chat, and I put on Facebook, you buy these goggles that allow you to see auras, because there's a certain ultraviolet component that would actually reveal who had an aura and who did not. And in the famous movie They Live, this would indicate where are the soulless ones.
Wow. Okay. Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, and this is actually there was a book called by Branton called Mysteries of the Mojave.
Branton.
And in that one, there's someone that actually has a pair of Kilner goggles, sees someone without an aura, and follows them to an old trailer in the middle of the desert. Knocks on the door, just wondering if they could give them directions out of there. And the guy opens the door, and he's got vertical split pupils.
Whoa.
Yeah, our friend Barbara was famous for tracking the vertical slit pupils around, and but I'll put the link. This link is actually from Elizabeth in the chat window.
Could this could this have to do with certain individuals not having an inner dialogue in some cases?
You know, the difference between the soulless ones and those who have an inner voice. Some people say an inner voice is schizophrenia. Others say if you don't have an inner voice, you don't have a soul. Who's right? You know.
Wow.
But we know that the most parasitics in the galaxy, the Nebu, which is the Greys, and to some extent the Draco, they're hive mind based. Certainly the Greys are, and they're very dangerous. Yeah. And you know, the Borg literally. And so the ability to have a soul, actually, if we say it from electrical engineering, probably has to do with the ability to access the longitudinal array from the implosion point inside your own plasma aura, actually.
Yeah. And you know, about the aura and the aura goggles, there was a book called The Human Atmosphere by Walter Kilner. And it's a great book, by the way. And Kilner did a lot of work on doing different differential diagnostics on people. For example, he noticed that when someone had an asymmetric aura, that meant that more often than not, they had a form of epilepsy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, this is, I'm getting, dare I say, I'm getting goosebumps. I've spoken to a lot of people who claimed when they were young suffered from what was coined or diagnosed as epilepsy, but they can now claim they're going through vortexes when they sleep. They're all these different things.
Yeah, I had a lady friend in Western New York who, actually in Mexico, who had quasi-epileptic, and it seemed to me like she was resisting her own bliss, that if she'd give way to her own bliss process, then the fusion would result and restore the symmetry in the aura.
Wow. Okay. So I'm not sure. Thank you so much for your time. I'm not sure how much more time the both of you have. I wanted to get to two more questions, if that's all right. Suhail asks, and I may be able to jump in on this as well, if I may. Suhail says, if humans don't inhabit other solar systems, will stars really start exploding like the time-traveling Draco have discovered or claimed? I would, before you guys go, I would just like to kindly preface that with not saying they're all bad, allegedly, Suhail. I would just very kindly be careful, because apparently these Greys and these Dracos tell lies like there's no tomorrow, but I could be wrong.
Well, the galactic history view from both Pleiadian and Andromedan and Elena Donavan is all very consistent. Tens of thousands of intelligent humanoid cultures in this galactic sector alone. However, it is true, we believe that stars support the evolution of DNA because we have the potential to make something sustainable, ultimately that makes starbirth sustainable, which is advanced plasma intelligences, example, the 9.
Okay, wow. Okay, so getting to the final one here, Riel asks, are iPhones designed to not catch these sort of phenomenon? Now, before I ask this, it's been claimed recently by Dr. Hal Puthoff and others that smartphones cannot pick up, regardless of optical lens quality, craft in the sky or phenomenon, if you will, because whatever is in the sky, whether truly there or not in a physical sense, are warping the space-time metric. Now, with that being said, I did want to ask the both of you if I could share my screen very quickly. Please forgive me for a bit of, I guess you could say, a not so good sketch, if you will. But if we were to presume that these vortexes represent just empty space as it's been coined, although we know it's not the case, positive charges, negative charges, all of this, would I be safe to hypothesize that publicly, and I guess this speaks to Miss Donavan more so, that it's been claimed, oh, gravity's a wave, but we have been fooled in the sense of we have just been shown the outline of these vortexes publicly and have been told this is all we know, when really there's a whole, again, other vortex below such waves, if you will, or the waves are simply the outline of these phase conjugate vortexes. Would that be an accurate hypothesis?
Well, maybe I could start briefly then, Elizabeth, but just gravity clearly is simply the acceleration of charge and the wavefront pattern of those accelerations of time charge, which Einstein incorrectly called bending spacetime. No, it's simply bending a line of charge compression, and that charge then accelerates, and the pattern of that acceleration we call gravity. And I think it was Elizabeth who properly suggested to me that the UFOs who can make a right turn at half the speed of light are carrying their own inertial frame with them, meaning that it has become so centripetal that what you feel is the centripetal force of the craft you're in, and not the right turn at 100,000 miles an hour you just made. That's called carrying your own inertial frame. But Elizabeth, go ahead, please, if you wish.
Yeah, it's kind of like a warp bubble in a way.
Yeah.
So it's disconnecting the outside universe from the inside bubble that you've created. And there have been several other papers that have been written about this. One is Alan Holt, and this is back in 1981, about a possible jump drive in a way. And what the jump drive essentially does is you take and all matter basically has its own resonance with a local vacuum. So what you do is you detune that resonance with the local vacuum, and then you retune it with a remote point. And what happens is that there's a macroscopic tunneling effect that occurs. So matter is basically flashing back and forth between its wave side and its quantum side. And it spends more time in its wave function side than in its quantum side. I mean, it's almost like an iceberg in a way, although it's not quite the same proportion. So what happens is that when you freeze out that quantum collapse, that means that now it's going to be disappearing from one location, reappearing in the other location instantaneously. So, and that means that you could have teletransportation, for example, teleportation, and without any energy involved in it, because you're not really accelerating or decelerating anything. You're just changing its locale.
And I'd have to say that some of the recent films we've made about the physics of Stargate, I would like to credit Elizabeth for some of those suggestions. For example, the phase conjugation at the liquid surface, the liquefaction point of the Stargate. But then that tunnel, I would suggest, Elizabeth, is part of a longitudinal array. For example, why Jodie Foster needed a dodeca in the movie Contact.
I wanted to just pose one more thing here from Riel. He says, could Elizabeth give a brief history of the suppression of technology mentioned? I know that's a bit of a big one,
Oh,
but if
boy.
I could give some
Yeah.
context.
Well, Elizabeth has a slideshow on that and has given formal lectures.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That subject.
Okay, if I may ask, does this follow the lines of Heinrich Hertz and Heaviside, quote unquote, interpreting Maxwell's equations after
Yeah,
1864?
that's part of it. Yeah. And what happened was that there was one guy, which was essentially it's Heaviside, and he rewrote electromagnetics.
Yeah.
And what he did was he took the gravitational side, sawed it off, and threw it away. But he also sawed off the four-dimensional side of this thing. So in order to really understand what's going on, you have to actually have extra dimensions to work with.
Yes, hyperspatial dimensions. And if I,
Right.
please tell me if I'm incorrect, but I believe that because of this butchering, this is essentially shut the door to any type of vacuum fluctuation extraction, anything like this. And
Absolutely. Yeah, not only
Right.
that, but when you're doing that, and you're not operating in higher dimension. Now, in physics, we already know that there's 12 dimensions down at the Planck level, at least. So when you're going down in the level, you're actually going up in dimensions. Kaluza-Klein was operating in 5 dimensions, and he had a unified field theory. And this is going way back, I believe it's in the 20s. So
Right.
the suppression has been such that as long as we're stuck in like a 3-dimensional reality and all of our equations only work with 3 dimensions, then we are trapped in this regauging system where you can't have free energy.
And those 22 or 23 quote unquote problems in mathematics will just remain unless that G is that gravitational extraction is allowed back into the equations.
Yeah, yeah.
To simplify in a way that Elizabeth, I believe, once said that in the quaternion, which is what Heaviside castrated, the 4th element represented spin. And the inability to represent spin is the inability to represent superposed axes of charge rotation, the only real definition of next dimension. So and when you superpose more and more axes of rotation, in order there to be constructive, not destructive interference, obviously you need golden ratio. And so that's where all the other superposed dimensions, for example, the ratcheting dodeca that makes DNA in a helix, the braid on the braid, it's all superposed axes of spin symmetry. But if you can't represent spin at all, you're in trouble.
So
Right.
if I may ask,
Well,
Elizabeth, in your
ahead.
opinion, is this why certain scientists, dare I say, no disrespect to any of them, but they don't sleep well at night when it comes to the concept of Lorentz covariance having to do with topology and physical realism sort of being the term they want to use instead of magic, so they can sleep a little bit better because they can observe it, but they realize something is there, but it's not in the physical, but the information structure is local.
It's in the extra dimensions. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And that's why
Well,
I
not
think
only that, but imagine this. Imagine how you would describe a 4-dimensional vortex in a 3-dimensional cross-section.
You can't.
That's the problem that we have.
You can't. It's impossible.
but
Right.
It's almost like Einstein calling action at a distance spooky because he didn't understand longitudinal interferometry. Well, the longitudinal interferometry requires phase conjugation, which is superposed axes of spin, literally 4th and 5th dimensions, for that implosive to compression to become longitudinally projective. So that wormhole that conventional physics calls entanglement creates Einstein-Rosen bridge actually is a longitudinal compressional tunnel created by phase conjugation from the superposed axes of spin next dimension. So the longitudinal component is generated specifically when you get that superposed axes of spin, idealized by golden ratio, dodeca ratchet, for example.
And Elizabeth and Dan, this, I guess, for the sake of trying to dumb it down in layman's terms, this is like trying to take a large box and trying to fit it into a smaller box. It's just not possible with respects to trying to understand 4th and 5th dimensional geometry and all of this in a 3-4 dimensional realm.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important that people have a personal sense of this as they're studying, for example. Now we know the plasma frequencies and the actual frequencies which trigger a lucid dream, predicting if you'll take memory through death. which is specifically the ability to inhabit a longitudinal array. And are we saying you need to know the math of what a longitudinal array is? No, but you do need to have a sense of what a compressional array creates inside, which is a larger and larger hologram, which is inhabitable if you're centripetal enough. So it is more than theoretical. It's very practical.
Is this why, Dan, sir, in your opinion, I wrote this down earlier, implosive charge collapse is needed for stargates of any kind to open or
Absolutely,
work?
sure. Well,
Okay.
but implosive charge collapse is needed for life force,
Everything.
gravity, consciousness, because
Right.
it's what gives you access to that wormhole. For example, again, when Freddie Silva made that famous film, The Art of Resurrection, the Templars said you needed to learn to die for 3 days, hint Jesus, and that was their initiation. The reason was, if you can inhabit that array and come back with reference to that, that was literally the art of resurrection.
So when the debate, when you had said during your presentation, Dan, when you said, and I quote, a vacuum is nothing or not, people often ask, is the vacuum something or is it nothing? My question to the both of you, and I don't claim to have the answer or anything, could it be both simultaneously, if that makes sense, pertaining
Oh,
to
it's definitely something. In fact, back in the 40s, this is coming from some old timers that
Sure.
did vacuum tube equations. You know, they were doing vacuum tube design, and so they had to calculate in the permittivity and the permeability of the vacuum. Otherwise, the vacuum tubes will not work. Okay, well, we know that physical substances have permittivity, which is capacitance, permeability, which is the magnetic side. So if you have to have those assigned to the vacuum, that means that there is a physical substance there. Some people are calling it the ether, but I mean, just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. I mean, that was the old argument that we had back in, you know, the 200 years ago when we discovered oxygen. And so it's definitely something there. As far as the active vacuum that the Russians were talking about, or now they're calling it the quantum vacuum. Okay, well, potato, potato.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's still there. So
yeah, and since we know the impedance of the vacuum, but to think of it in a way that the average person could, if you visualize the compression and rarefaction of charge being the superfluid, which is the vacuum or is the ether, then you can understand that superfluid is just creating a distribution in an array. So basically, visualizing that universal superfluid is the beginning, which is charge.
Could we say
but
this?
now, okay, so if it's got impedance, that means that it's got a resonant frequency to it.
Right.
If it's got a resonant frequency to it,
Vacuum.
that means now, if you can couple into that resonance, you could put energy in, you could take energy out.
Exactly.
If you put energy into it, that means that you can actually change the dimensionality of that vacuum. And then we get into the Doctor Who stuff and warp drives and all of this.
Would you have to collapse the wave of that frequency first, though?
Well,
not necessarily so.
Well, I mean, if I may say, our specialty, we think, is the frequency signature of perfected collapse. That's what we think we've identified here. And that obviously is Planck times integer exponential golden ratio. And that imposes. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, Dan. Does this speak to The Emperor's New Mind by Sir Roger Penrose? I mean, it's something within the microtubules of the brain that allow for collapsing the wave. Allegedly, this is just one way or style of many. It was largely ridiculed for years, and then all of a sudden it's being brought back up again, the book, you know, oh so conveniently, but.
Well, first of all, Stuart Hameroff, a model of consciousness in the microtubes, was actually useful, but drastically incomplete. Because actually, it's implosion of a plasma, a much larger plasma field than just a micro. But the microtubule was the beginning of that. It was implosive collapse in the membrane layering geometry in the microtubule itself, which could then participate or embed in a much larger implosive plasma tube collapse, which is the tornado that the kids see inside their heads when they see without their eyes. But and also we should mention that Nassim very usefully described a model of perfected charge collapse from Penrose tiling, which is just tiling dodecacosa around a sphere with Planck dimensions and modeling perfected charge collapse. So lots of people have approached that conversation from different directions, all toward the same concept, perfected charge collapse.
And that vortex seems to remind me of, again, the Naga from ancient Egypt, the DNA double helix. And if you notice with the toroid field, if one could visually envision collapsing the wave in the center of that entire vortex, that would be the self-implosion you're speaking on.
Actually, that's why the article on our human history is called fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood.
Right.
Precisely that implosive vortex in the DNA, literally the physics of soul, the longitudinal component of the hydrogen component, that center of every DNA ladder rung, imploding in the presence of bliss. Oh yeah, that's have a soul.
I'm so sorry that I just keep going, but Elizabeth, if I may ask, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Roger Penrose recently winning the Nobel Prize on spinners and vectors, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think that was a deliberate dissemination to slowly prepare academia, and then largely
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a feeling. Yeah, because the Emperor's New Mind was written in the mid '80s, I believe, and it was considered fringe science. And all of a sudden, Hammeroff and Penrose, and then Penrose wins the Nobel Prize on spinners and vectors, and it's like everyone, the community, at least from my perspective, the academic community on the surface seemed quite thrown off. Like, hold on, there's something to this. And what I like about Mr. Penrose is he does not seem to state his way is the only way. It's simply maybe one slice of the metaphorical pie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, everyone seems to
Sure,
agree that
sure. Then it gets into the torsion fields as well. So that's a whole other thing.
and the Russian term torsion versus the Western term scalar, the torsion was of the geometry of the perfected vortex, which is everyone's problem. What is the geometry of perfected charge collapse? That is the only real question here, actually.
Does anyone find it interesting, particularly Elizabeth and Dan, that the Americans seem to be eager to work with the Soviets in the 70s and 80s? Maybe, dare I say, because the Soviets got the telekinesis guys and the Americans got the materials knowledge guys. Hence, they realized collaboration was required to understand phase conjugation.
Well, the superficial analysis was the Soviets got the phase conjugate radar engineers, the American rocket engineers, and the phase conjugate radar engineers is the solution to most everything we're talking about today.
It's just the chronology of the timeline just keeps adding up.
Yeah. Not only that, in traditional EM, what they're really talking about are just really two modes of propagation as far as polarization of the EM wave. One is, you've got the vertical polarization, you've got horizontal, then you've got circular polarization, which is very, very interesting because circular polarization starts to get into this torsion field aspect.
Yeah.
So,
and in fact, the Kansas RF frequency that made over unity hydrolysis, the RF frequency was Golden ratio times Planck and had to be a circularly polarized antenna. And when you talk to the antenna engineers and try to differentiate that between what is a longitudinal antenna, it's a very complicated question. But basically, you rotate the spin, and if it implodes and conjugates, then it becomes longitudinally projected. So,
is this why Hertz seems to be, at least on the public level, only measured in high frequencies, and the concept of ultra low frequencies has sort of been not debunked but rather dismissed because of the fact that the frequencies that hug the ground, that are used by governments with these towers and what have you, can in fact be measured below the infrared spectrum?
Well, infrasound is the key to not just HARP, but brain waves of bliss and the heart waves of bliss and Therify implosion, infrasound, and how pyramids made energy. It was all infrasound.
Wow. Okay. Because I noticed that about 3 weeks back, I did a presentation and I cited of all places, a WHO PDF right from their website that showed the human body when it's not touching the ground in just the mid-air, and you see the ultra low frequency waves wrap around the body seemingly very comfortably. And then there's a model or a sketch of the human body standing on the earth, and you see the extremely low frequency waves wrap like tightly around the feet and then work its way up the body. And then, I'm not trying to say it was our show or anything like this. I did this presentation, I took it public, and then 48 hours later, I find out that the WHO removed it from their website. So, someone brought it up to me, so I don't know.
And the physics of grounding is the issue. That, the Sufi master says, track your attention, follow the gravity through your feet to the center of the earth and then the center of the sun. And when your attention gets there, you will steer a plasma vortex of that larger size. So that the harmonics that allow grounding, the book Earthing, ultimately produce your aura that is the size of a star.
Wow. Well, I mean, if it's all right with you guys for just 2 more minutes, I wanted to give maybe one more question from the audience because I feel bad for hogging it a little bit, but I cannot thank you enough for the both of you for coming on. Does anyone have any quick questions you'd like to ask of either Elizabeth or Dan?
Real is there. Yes, Real.
Please, Rio.
Yeah, I've got a question. So you mentioned that, let's see, space is charge. And so I'm trying to understand why they call it outer space. Like what, like, I mean, I know that all this stuff about suppression and all that, and it's interesting because they define outer space by anything above the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometers above sea level. But like from NASA's perspective, what do they think space is? Like,
Us.
why would they like
Perception? That's my...
Well, I think that what they're talking about is basically anything that's above the atmosphere. So,
and
that's their conception of it.
And Elizabeth did a pretty good job of saying what the vacuum contains, which we say is an infinite superfluid of charge, compression, rarefaction. So the short summary is the universe is made of a single substance. It's infinitely compressible and behaves like a superfluid. And calling it charge or ether, doesn't matter what you name it, but the compression, rarefaction thereof, plus or minus charge, is a pretty good metaphor. And what inhabits all of space is that superfluid.
The superfluid, yeah. And I mean, it acts like a superfluid, but it also, it's kind of stretchy.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, you can actually, you can pluck it like a string and get it to ring. So when you ring the vacuum, of course, then you get into the resonance aspects.
Exactly.
And if I may ask, the reason you can pluck it or stretch it like a string is because of the locality of your individual perception of it.
Well, you get more leverage on the space if you're at the cross point of the compression waves, the longitudinal waves, which is why every shaman would go to the magnetic line cross point, every pyramid, every cathedral, every labyrinth, every telepathy event, and the effect on the nuclear critical mass. It all depended on your location at the cross point nodes, because that's where the radio exists, that longitudinal array.
Right, because I couldn't help but think of correlating this to the concept of in quantum physics, reality is only as real as the individual observing it, such as, the Casimir effect, or the astrophysicist Alexei Novitzky proposing that, again, space is constant. It's not that space, if you will, is expanding and contracting, but perception is, and the fluid is relative to that, possibly.
Yeah, physics has long been clear that focusing or perceiving something changes it. But now that we know what focus is, which is a plasma vortex, what happens inside your head when you see someone, when children see without their eyes, for example, that plasma vortex is perception. And obviously, since it's doing charge compression, we now know why focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. Bill Tiller measured many times. So we know exactly why. Pardon?
The fluid is the conductor?
Well, the fluid has to be compressed in order for perception to happen. That the act of perceiving something causes a centripetal effect. That's why they say that there's alarm bells for remote viewers at Area 51. Well,
right. And is this, Scott asks, is that why the moon rings like a bell? 4-hour earthquakes?
Well, that's more simple,
Well, it's a little different.
Yeah, the moon rings like a bell because the Andromedans had a spare hollow planetoid metal to stick in here. The orbit of half the planets in the solar system was falling apart after the Orion Wars zapped and that caused the Great Flood, the Dryads, when they were trying to eject. And so they stuck in a hollow metal moon, which did stabilize the Earth orbit, and then it was infested with Grays and Dracos for years. And read Elaine and Donavan and the Palladians, they just kicked out the bad guys, and
here we are
being rehabilitated. I think Elaine is right.
Elizabeth, before we wrap this up, would you like to jump in at all?
Yeah, as far as the moon goes, I've heard that as well. But there are other planetoids that also do the same kind of ringing, and I think Richard Hoagland talks about that in some of Saturn's moons. And one in particular looks a lot like the Death Star from Star Wars. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
If I may ask, not to put you on the spot, Elizabeth, if I could get your contact information via Dan afterwards, if that would be possible.
Sure, that's
If
fine. Sure.
thank you so much.
Mhm.
So thank you so much, everyone. For those in which, let me see, where there were a couple more questions, what I can do, if it's all right, is email it to the both of you if you guys need to take off, and I'll ensure that they get answered. Let me just copy and paste them. All right, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll catch you all next time. And truly, Miss Donavan, thank you, and Dan, thank you so much for inviting Elizabeth to come to this call.
Yeah, thank you. It's so empowering for people to understand why 0-point energy exists, because if you get more fractal, then you get to implode. There's the bliss.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. Truly appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Thank
Rio.
you. Okay, bye.
We had some fun. Thanks, guys.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Bye-bye.